Welcome to Silent Secrets. I'm your host for tonight's mystery. Today's tale begins with a quiet moment, a simple knock, a forgotten letter, and a truth that was never meant to be discovered. Chapter 1. Midnight stops January 1st, arrived wrapped in a silence so complete that it felt deliberate, as though the night itself were holding its breath. Snow lay thick across the grounds of Hercule Point House, muting every sound, smoothing every path, and sealing the old seaside estate away from the rest of the world. The sea beyond the cliffs was invisible in the darkness, but its presence could be felt in the air, cold, damp, and heavy with salt. Inside the house, warmth glowed from shaded lamps and the crackling fire in the drawing room. The household had gathered there in subdued celebration, not with laughter or champagne, but with the restrained politeness that marked all things at Hercule Point. Samuel Wright, the owner of the house, had insisted on a quiet New Year. He disliked noise, disorder, and, most of all, surprises. Hercule Poirot noticed this immediately. He sat slightly apart from the others, neat and composed in his chair, his posture precise, his expression attentive. His eyes small, dark, and extraordinarily alert, moved constantly, taking in details others ignored. The faint tension in the shoulders of the guests, the way certain glances lingered too long, or avoided one another entirely, the subtle impatience in the tapping fingers of a man who claimed to be at ease. Samuel Wright stood near the mantelpiece, his back straight, despite his 60 years, his silver hair carefully combed. He held a glass of brandy but had not touched it. The firelight revealed a face of firm lines and careful control, a man accustomed to command and obedience. To his right sat Eleanor Wright, his wife, pale and elegant, her hands folded in her lap. She smiled when spoken to, but the smile never reached her eyes. Near the window stood Marcus Hill, Samuel's business partner, tall and broad-shouldered, pretending an interest in the darkened grounds outside. On the sofa, Clara Finch, Samuel's private secretary, clutched a small notebook to her chest as though it were a shield. And hovering near the doorway was Nathan Cole, the household manager, alert and watchful, listening for bells that had not yet rung. Poirot observed them all with gentle interest, like a man admiring a complex arrangement whose pattern was not yet clear. 10 seconds, announced Samuel Wright, glancing at the large grandfather clock that dominated the far wall. Its polished wood gleamed in the firelight, its brass pendulum swinging with calm authority. The clock was old. Poirot had examined it earlier, with professional curiosity. It had been meticulously maintained, wound daily by Nathan Cole at precisely the same hour. Such clocks, Poirot knew, did not fail without reason. 5:43, the room stilled further, even the fire seemed to quiet. 2:1. The clock struck. One clear chime echoed through the drawing room, then another, then another. 12 strokes rang out, each one crisp and measured, marking the arrival of the new year. At the 12th chime, something changed. The sound stopped, not gradually, not with a falter, but abruptly, as though the clock itself had been silenced by an unseen hand. The pendulum froze mid-swing, the second hand halted between moments, pointing nowhere. In that same instant, Samuel Wright made a small sound, not a cry, not a word, but a soft exhalation of surprise. His glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the hearth. He staggered forward, one hand clutching at his chest, his mouth opening as if to speak. He never did. Samuel Wright collapsed onto the rug, his body striking the floor with a dull, final sound for a heartbeat. No one moved. Then Eleanor Wright screamed. The stillness shattered into chaos. Marcus Hill rushed forward, kneeling beside the fallen man. Clara Finch stood frozen, her face drained of color, her notebook slipping from her grasp. Nathan Cole rang for help, his voice sharp with panic as he shouted down the corridor. Poirot alone remained seated. His eyes were fixed not on the body, but on the clock. "It is most interesting," he murmured softly. Dr. Leonard Ames, summoned from the guest rooms, where he had retired early, arrived within minutes. He knelt beside Samuel Wright, checked for a pulse, listened at the chest, and finally shook his head. "He's gone," the doctor said quietly. "Heart failure, instantaneous." Eleanor Wright sank into a chair, sobbing into a handkerchief. Marcus Hill rose slowly, his face grim. Nathan Cole instructed the staff in hushed, urgent tones. "It was his heart," Hill said, more to himself than to anyone else. "He had trouble last year. The strain, the business, the stress." "Yes," said Poirot calmly. "The heart is a delicate instrument." All eyes turned to him. Poirot stood now, smoothing his jacket with care. He walked toward the clock, examining it closely. The pendulum was still frozen, the mechanism silent. "Is something wrong with it?" Clara Finch asked weakly. "Madame," Poirot replied gently, "there is something very wrong indeed." Nathan Cole frowned. "It must be a coincidence. The cold, perhaps, old machinery." Poirot raised a hand, polite but firm. "I do not believe in coincidence," he said. "Not when two events occur at precisely the same second. A man's heart stops, a clock stops, both without warning, both exact." Dr. Ames looked uneasy. "You're suggesting—" "What exactly?" "I am suggesting nothing," Poirot said mildly. "I am observing." He turned back to the group, his gaze moving from face to face. "Tell me," he continued, "did anyone touch the clock this evening?" "No," Nathan Cole replied at once. "I wound it myself at 9 as always." "And the brandy?" Poirot asked, glancing at the broken glass. "Did Monsieur Wright drink?" "No, Eleanor," Wright said between sobs. "He barely touched alcohol." Poirot nodded. "Then, perhaps," he said quietly, "we must look beyond the obvious." Outside, the wind rose, rattling faintly against the windows. Snow continued to fall, sealing Charcoal Point House tighter in its white isolation. Midnight had arrived. Time itself had stopped, and Hercule Poirot knew, with absolute certainty, that a murder had just occurred, even if no one else yet understood it. Chapter 2. A house in denial morning arrived, reluctantly at Charcoal Point House. The sun, pale and uncertain, struggled through thick winter clouds, casting a weak light over the snowbound estate. The world outside appeared unchanged, untouched by the violence of the night. But inside the house, time felt distorted, as though the frozen clock had infected everything with its stillness. The grandfather clock remained where it stood, silent and unmoving. No one had dared to touch it. Samuel Wright's body had been removed to the small study adjoining the drawing room, laid out with solemn care and covered respectfully. The house carried on in whispers, footsteps softened by unease, doors closed gently. Conversations died when footsteps approached. Charcoal Point House was a place in denial. The family gathered once more in the drawing room, drawn again and again toward the clock, like moths to a dangerous flame. "It was the cold," Marcus Hill said firmly, his voice too loud for the quiet room. "These old houses, drafts everywhere, the mechanism probably seized." Nathan Cole nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir. Sea air, cold temperatures. It happens. I've seen clocks stop before." "And Samuel's heart," Eleanor Wright added softly, her face composed but brittle. "The doctor said it was weak. He had been tired lately." Poirot listened without interruption, seated comfortably near the fire. His hands were folded, his expression mild, almost indulgent. He allowed the words to pass over him like waves, noting their rhythm, their urgency, their desperation. Clara Finch sat apart from the others, perched stiffly on the edge of a chair. Her eyes moved constantly, from the clock to the covered doorway of the study, then to Poirot. When she realized he was watching her, she looked down at once. Dr. Ames cleared his throat. "Medically speaking, the death was neat," he said, choosing his words carefully. "There was no sign of distress, no cry, no convulsions. He simply collapsed." "Exactly," Marcus Hill said. "That proves it. Sudden heart failure." Poirot lifted his head slightly. "Or," he said gently, "it proves something else." Marcus stiffened. "You keep implying that this was not natural." Poirot smiled faintly. Monsieur, I imply nothing. I observe. He rose and crossed the room, stopping before the clock. In daylight, its presence was even more imposing. Tall, dignified, authoritative. Poirot leaned close, examining the face. You see, he continued, speaking almost to himself, this clock did not slow. It did not stutter. It stopped precisely, cleanly. As cleanly, one might say, as the heart of Monsieur Wright. Nathan Cole shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I swear no one tampered with it. Poirot turned. Ah, but that is not what I asked. I asked only if someone touched it. No, Cole said again, more firmly. No one, Poirot nodded. Then we must consider how it could be made to stop without being touched. Eleanor Wright looked at him sharply. Are you suggesting someone sabotaged a clock? To frighten us? Poirot's eyes met hers. Madame, I suggest only that clocks do not share their fate with men by accident. Silence followed. The words hung heavily in the air, unsettling and unwelcome. Marcus Hill folded his arms. This house is in mourning. We don't need theories. No, Poirot agreed softly. What you need is the truth. He moved toward the study doorway, lifting the edge of the cloth covering Samuel Wright's body just enough to observe the face. It was calm, almost peaceful. There was no distortion, no sign of pain. Too peaceful, Poirot murmured. Clara Finch spoke suddenly. He didn't even cry out. All eyes turned to her. I mean, she said quickly, flustered, if someone's heart fails, wouldn't they gasp or clutch at something? He didn't call for help. Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. An excellent observation, Madam Miss Finch. Dr. Ames frowned. Not necessarily. Sudden cardiac arrest can be instantaneous. Yes, Poirot agreed, but it can also be encouraged. Eleanor Wright rose abruptly. This is absurd. You're turning an illness into a crime. Poirot straightened. His voice remained calm, but something firm entered it now. He gestured toward the clock. The time, the silence, the absence of struggle, the absence of witnesses. Perfection is rare in nature, but common in design. Nathan Cole swallowed. What are you saying? Poirot looked at each of them in turn. I am saying, he replied, that this house is trying very hard not to think. Outside, the wind howled softly along the cliffs. Inside, the clock remained frozen at midnight. And denial, Poirot knew, was often the murderer's greatest ally. Chapter 3. Time as an alibi by late morning. Charcoal Point House had slipped into a strange routine, one shaped not by clocks, but by memory. With the grandfather clock still frozen at midnight, time had become an idea rather than a measurement, and everyone clung to it with nervous precision. Poirot requested that each person recount their movements during the final hour of the year. Not later. Not generally, precisely. They gathered again in the drawing room, the same room where Samuel Wright had fallen. The furniture had been subtly rearranged, the broken glass removed, the rug cleaned, order had been restored. But Poirot noticed that no one sat where Samuel Wright had stood. Marcus Hill went first. I was with Samuel until about 11:30, he said. We discussed accounts in the study. At 45 minutes past, I returned here. I added coal to the fire. Miss Finch was already present. Clara Finch nodded. Yes, I was reviewing correspondence by the desk. At 11:50, Mr. Cole brought in tea. Nathan Cole inclined his head. That's correct. I poured tea for everyone except Mr. Wright, he declined. Eleanor Wright spoke next, her voice steady. I was upstairs until 11:40. I came down to join the others shortly before midnight. I stood near the mantel. Samuel was already there. Dr. Ames adjusted his glasses. I excused myself earlier, around 11. I was in my room when I heard the clock strike. Each account was clear, measured, polite. Poirot listened, his head slightly tilted, fingertips pressed together. He asked no questions at first, allowing the words to settle like pieces on a board. Most admirable, he said finally. You see how beautifully time behaves when everyone cooperates. Marcus frowned. Are you mocking us? Not at all, Poirot replied mildly. I am admiring. He stood and walked slowly around the room, stopping occasionally, as though the floor itself was speaking to him. You see, he continued. Time has become your alibi. The clock stops. Midnight is fixed, everything before it aligns neatly, like a railway schedule. He turned to Clara Finch. Miss Finch, you said you were reviewing correspondence. May I ask, what correspondence requires attention at such a late hour? She hesitated. Mr. Wright insisted. Business matters, he liked to begin the year informed. Poirot nodded. And you took notes? Yes, always. And where are those notes now? Clara flushed. In my room. Poirot made a mental note. He turned to Nathan Cole. You brought tea at 11:50. Did you notice anything unusual? No, sir, Cole replied quickly. Everything was normal. Normal, Poirot repeated softly. A dangerous word. He approached the fire. You say you added coal, Monsieur Hill. At what time exactly? About 11:40. 5. Poirot crouched slightly, examining the grate. Interesting. The coal appears recently placed, yet the ash beneath suggests it was not burning long. Hill stiffened. What are you implying? Nothing, Poirot said pleasantly. Only that fires, like clocks, tell stories. He straightened and looked around the room once more. You all agree on one thing, he said, that nothing happened. Eleanor Wright's eyes flashed, because nothing did, until Samuel collapsed. Poirot inclined his head. And yet, Madame, something must have happened. A man does not simply step out of life at the precise second a clock stops, unless time itself has been arranged. Dr. Ames sighed. You're seeing patterns because you expect them. Poirot smiled faintly. No, Doctor. I distrust patterns that are too neat. He returned to his chair. Perfect order, he said quietly, is rarely innocent. It is often constructed, carefully, patiently, so that time itself becomes a shield. The room fell silent again. Each of them had accounted for their minutes. Each of them was protected by the frozen clock. And Hercule Poirot knew, with growing certainty, that the murderer was hiding not in chaos, but in precision. Chapter 4. The doctor's certainty. Dr. Leonard Ames spoke with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being believed. They were assembled in the smaller sitting room now, away from the frozen clock, though its presence seemed to follow them all the same. Light filtered through tall windows, pale and winter, weak. Outside, the snow showed no sign of melting. Inside, certainty was being constructed, brick by brick. I examined Samuel Wright thoroughly, Dr. Ames said. His hands folded neatly in his lap. There were no visible injuries, no marks, no abrasions, no signs of violence. His heart simply stopped. Eleanor Wright released a shallow breath, as though she had been holding it since midnight. Marcus Hill nodded, grim but relieved. Nathan Cole stood straight, attentive. Clara Finch watched the doctor with a kind of desperate hope. Poirot watched them all. Sudden cardiac failure, the doctor continued. It can strike without warning, especially in men of Samuel's age. But you said, Poirot interjected gently, that Monsieur Wright was in good health. For his age, Ames replied quickly. He was cautious, predictable. He avoided excess, but the heart is a treacherous thing. Poirot inclined his head. Yes, it can betray us. He rose and approached the doctor, his tone polite, almost deferential. Permit me one question, Doctor. Did you observe anything, however small, that caused you surprise? Ames hesitated. Surprise. Anything that did not quite fit your expectation? The doctor frowned. Everything was consistent with sudden death. Poirot smiled faintly. Everything? Yes. Poirot walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. You see, he said thoughtfully, what troubles me is not the death itself, but its punctuality. Marcus Hill scoffed. You keep returning to the clock. Because it keeps returning to me, Poirot replied calmly. He turned. Doctor, how often does sudden cardiac failure choose a precise second? Ames stiffened. That's not how medicine works. Indeed, Poirot agreed. Medicine deals in probability. This death deals in exactitude. Silence followed. Eleanor Wright spoke sharply. You're turning coincidence into conspiracy. Poirot met her gaze. Madame, coincidence is lazy. This was not. He approached Samuel Wright's study. Now empty but still heavy with absence, he gestured toward the doorway. Your husband collapsed at the precise moment the clock stopped. Not before. Not after. The timing is perfect. Dr. Ames shifted in his seat. You're suggesting poison? I suggest nothing, Poirot said. I ask. There was no sign of poison, Ames replied firmly. No smell, no discoloration, no distress. Poirot nodded. Poisons are no longer crude, Doctor. They are polite, discreet, patient. Nathan Cole cleared his throat. Sir, if there was poison, wouldn't we have noticed something in his drink? Poirot turned. What drink, Monsieur Cole? The brandy, Cole said. He was holding it. But he did not drink it, Poirot replied. The glass was full, Cole hesitated. Then perhaps earlier. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. Earlier is interesting. He turned to Clara Finch. Miss Finch, how long had Monsieur Wright been in the drawing room before midnight? About 15 minutes, she said. He came in after speaking with Mr. Hill. And before that, she swallowed. He was in the study, alone. Poirot smiled softly. Alone is another dangerous word. Dr. Ames stood. You're stretching this beyond reason. No, Poirot said quietly. I am narrowing it. He returned to his seat. Samuel Wright was healthy, cautious, predictable, Poirot said. Men like that do not die dramatically. They die quietly, conveniently. Marcus Hill frowned. Convenient for whom? Poirot looked at him. That, monsieur, is the correct question. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, steady and patient. Inside, certainty began to crack. Precision, Poirot knew, did not belong to fate. It belonged to people. Chapter 5. The clockmaker's secret Poirot asked to be left alone with the clock. This request caused visible discomfort. Nathan Cole hesitated before agreeing. Marcus Hill exchanged a glance with Eleanor Wright. Clara Finch looked as though she wished to protest, then thought better of it. Dr. Ames merely shrugged, the confidence of medicine still firm around him. At last, the drawing room emptied, silence returned, deep, deliberate, and watchful. Poirot stood before the grandfather clock for a long time without touching it. He examined its proportions, the curve of its hood, the faint scratches along the base, where generations of polishing had thinned the wood. This was not merely a timepiece, it was a fixture of authority. In this house, it told people when to gather, when to sleep, when the day officially began. Clocks, Poirot believed, reflected the souls of those who owned them. Only after this contemplation did he open the narrow side panel. The mechanism inside was immaculate, cleaned, oiled, cared for with respect. Nathan Cole had not exaggerated his devotion. The brass gleamed softly, the gears aligned with almost mathematical elegance. Poirot leaned closer. His fingers hovered near a small adjustment screw, barely noticeable unless one knew exactly what to look for. It sat near the escapement, innocent, modest, easily overlooked. Yet it had been tightened far more than necessary. Poirot did not touch it at first. He examined the surrounding metal, a faint mark, recent. This screw, Poirot said softly to the empty room, does not belong to chance. He straightened, considering. Such a screw was not part of normal maintenance. It was not adjusted casually, nor by someone unfamiliar with clocks, tightened just enough. It would create resistance at a specific stress point, allowing the clock to function normally until a precise moment when motion itself would become impossible, not broken, stopped, on command. Poirot stepped back, folding his arms. Time, he said quietly, has been instructed to stop. He closed the panel and rang for Nathan Cole. The household manager entered at once, his expression wary. You take excellent care of this clock, Poirot said pleasantly. Yes, sir, every day. And yet, Poirot continued, you did not adjust this screw. Cole stiffened. I wouldn't dare. That's not part of the winding. Just so, Poirot replied. Then you know what it does? Cole swallowed. It's an old feature from the original maker. My predecessor showed me years ago. Ah, said Poirot. So the knowledge exists? Yes, but only someone familiar with the house. Poirot finished gently. Cole nodded, uncomfortable. Someone who'd been here a long time or studied it. Poirot dismissed him and sent for the others. They returned reluctantly, drawn again to the clock, as though to a witness stand. Poirot addressed them calmly. This clock was stopped, deliberately, he said. Not damaged, not frozen by cold, stopped. Marcus Hill reacted first. That's absurd. On the contrary, Poirot replied. It is very precise. He explained the screw, its function, its timing. He spoke clearly, without drama, allowing the implications to settle naturally. Eleanor Wright's face tightened. You're saying someone planned this? Yes, to create a distraction, Marcus asked. No, Poirot said softly, to create a moment. Clara Finch whispered, but why? Poirot turned to her. Because a death without witnesses is valuable, because when time stops, attention follows it. He gestured toward the frozen hands. Every eye was on the clock, every mind marked the hour, and while time announced itself, something else was allowed to pass unnoticed. Dr. Ames frowned. You're suggesting the clock was part of the murder. I am saying, Poirot replied, that the clock was an accomplice. Silence pressed in again, heavier now. Poirot's gaze moved slowly from face to face. Only someone who knew this house, he continued, who understood its habits, its rituals, its certainties, could have used time itself as a tool. He paused. And such a person, Poirot added quietly, would also know exactly when a man like Samuel Wright could be made to die without a sound. The clock remained frozen, but the house at last had begun to move. Chapter 6. The final drink. The glass still stood where it had fallen from Samuel Wright's hand. It had been returned to the side table after the chaos of the night, washed of broken shards around it, yet never emptied. Its position was careful, respectful, as though the household feared altering even the smallest detail of that moment. The amber liquid inside caught the pale afternoon light and held it, calm and unremarkable. Brandy, one would say, ordinary, comforting, a gentleman's indulgence. Hercule Poirot did not touch it. He stood before the table with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the glass as if it were a face that refused to confess. The others watched from a cautious distance, Eleanor Wright seated stiffly on the sofa, Marcus Hill leaning against the mantel, Clara Finch hovering uncertainly near the writing desk, Nathan Cole stationed close to the door. Dr. Ames stood apart, his professional composure masking a flicker of irritation. It has been sitting here all night and most of the day, Ames said. If there were poison, it would have shown itself by now. Poirot inclined his head. Doctor, some poisons are impatient, others are very well mannered. He gestured toward the fire. Monsieur Cole, would you be so kind as to bring a small warming tray? Nathan Cole hesitated, then obeyed. When he returned, Poirot instructed him to place the tray beside the table, close enough that warmth would rise gently toward the glass without disturbing it. Poirot watched intently as the temperature changed. Not dramatically, not hurriedly, but with subtle insistence. The room was silent save for the faint crackle of embers. Minutes passed. Then Poirot leaned forward. There, he said quietly. The scent had changed. It was slight. So slight that only someone expecting it would notice. The comforting sweetness of the brandy had acquired a sharper undertone, faintly bitter, faintly metallic. It did not announce itself. It revealed itself. Clara Finch pressed a hand to her mouth. "I smell it now." Dr. Ames stepped closer, despite himself. He sniffed, frowned, and then straightened sharply. "That's not brandy," he said. "Not entirely." "No," Poirot replied. "It is brandy that has been persuaded." Marcus Hill's voice was tight. "Persuaded how?" Poirot turned, his expression calm but intent. "By heat," he said. "By patience. By time." He lifted the glass carefully, holding it toward the light. "Some substances are dormant when cold, inert, harmless. They awaken only when warmed, slowly, gently, just as this room warmed as midnight approached." Dr. Ames swallowed. "You're saying the poison wasn't active immediately?" "Exactly," Poirot said. "A slow, acting agent, one that enters the bloodstream quietly, one that waits." Eleanor Wright's fingers clenched around her handkerchief. "Waits for what?" Poirot looked at the frozen clock across the room. "For midnight." He set the glass down again, untouched. "Samuel Wright held this glass for several minutes before he collapsed," Poirot continued. "Long enough for the poison to warm, long enough for it to activate, long enough for it to reach the heart." Dr. Ames nodded slowly now, his certainty eroding. "That would explain the lack of distress. Certain compounds can induce cardiac arrest without pain, without warning, without struggle," Poirot added, "without a cry." Clara Finch whispered, "So the clock." "The clock," Poirot said gently, "was not the killer, it was the cover." He turned to face them fully. "When the clock stopped, it commanded attention. All eyes went to it, all minds fixed on the moment. Midnight became the event. The death merely followed it." Marcus Hill ran a hand through his hair. "You're saying whoever did this planned everything around the time?" "Yes," Poirot replied. "Time was the alibi. Time was the distraction. Time was instructed to behave." Nathan Cole spoke hoarsely. "But who could do such a thing? Who would know about the clock, the heat, the poison?" Poirot's gaze settled on him briefly. "Someone intimate with this house, someone who understood its rhythms, its habits." He turned to Clara Finch. "Miss Finch, you prepared the evening arrangements." "Yes," she said faintly. "And you poured the brandy?" "No," she replied quickly. "Mr. Wright poured it himself." Poirot nodded. "Indeed, which makes the method even more elegant." Dr. Ames frowned. "Then how was the poison introduced?" Poirot smiled slightly. "Not into the glass, into the bottle." A murmur rippled through the room. "The bottle," Poirot continued, "was shared on previous evenings. The quantity of poison was minute, insufficient to cause harm when cold. Only when warmed slowly in the hand, near a fire, would it awaken. Only when enough time had passed." Eleanor Wright's voice was barely audible. "And the timing." Poirot gestured toward the clock again. The clock ensured the poison's effect coincided with a spectacle. Midnight, a moment, no one would forget. A moment, everyone would remember exactly the same way. Marcus Hill's face had gone pale. So it was planned. "Yes," Poirot said softly, "with extraordinary care." He walked slowly around the room, his voice steady, precise. "The poison was chosen for its discretion. The clock was altered for its certainty. The setting ensured warmth. The witnesses ensured agreement. Every element served the same purpose, to make murder appear like fate." Silence pressed in, heavy and oppressive. Poirot stopped near the side table, resting one hand lightly beside the glass. "Samuel Wright died because someone understood that people trust time," he said. "They trust clocks. They trust routine. They trust the ordinary." He looked up, his eyes sharp now. And that trust was exploited. The frozen clock loomed behind him, its hands still fixed at midnight. But the truth, at last, had begun to move. Chapter 7. Motives beneath the hours the will was not meant to be discussed until morning. That, Poirot discovered, was precisely the problem. It was Eleanor Wright who mentioned it first, reluctantly, as though the words themselves offended her sense of propriety. They were seated in the library now, a room Samuel Wright had favored for its order and restraint. The shelves were immaculate, the chairs positioned with deliberate symmetry. Even grief here was expected to behave. There was a conversation, Eleanor said, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Earlier that day. Poirot inclined his head. About the future? Yes. Her voice faltered, then steadied. Samuel had decided changes were necessary. Marcus Hill stiffened at once. What changes? He asked. Eleanor looked at him coolly. You know very well. Poirot's eyes moved between them, attentive, alert. Perhaps, he said gently, it would help if we all knew. Eleanor drew a careful breath. Samuel intended to revise his will. He had become dissatisfied. With whom? Poirot asked. With everyone, she replied quietly. The silence that followed was dense, weighted with old resentments. He believed, Eleanor continued, that people had grown complacent, dependent. He wanted to remind us that everything we had came from him and could be taken away. Marcus Hill's jaw tightened. He was always like that. But yesterday, Eleanor said, he decided to act. Poirot leaned forward slightly. What prompted this decision? Eleanor hesitated. He felt time was no longer on his side. That phrase caught Poirot's attention at once. He had been to his solicitor that morning, she went on. He returned, resolved. He said the new year demanded clarity and control, Marcus muttered. Poirot turned to him. Monsieur Hill, you were present. Yes, Hill said sharply. He told me himself. What did he tell you? That my stake in the company would be delayed another 5 years. 5. Hill's voice shook despite his effort. I've devoted decades to that business. Poirot nodded slowly. And this delay, was it conditional? Yes, Hill snapped, on his continued approval. Poirot's gaze remained steady, which could be withdrawn at any time. Hill said nothing. Poirot turned to Clara Finch. And you, Miss Finch, were you promised something? Clara's hands trembled. He had once suggested a provision for me, for my loyalty. Yesterday, he said it would have to wait indefinitely. Poirot watched her carefully. Did he explain why? She swallowed. He said loyalty should not expect reward. Eleanor let out a brittle laugh. That sounds like Samuel. Poirot turned back to her. And you, madame? Eleanor's eyes flashed. He intended to place my inheritance in trust, controlled by executors. I would receive an allowance. An allowance, Poirot repeated softly. Yes, she said, after 30 years of marriage. Poirot folded his hands together. So, he said calmly, control was tightened, promises were withdrawn, patience was tested. Marcus Hill rose abruptly and began pacing. This is irrelevant. Plenty of people are disappointed by wills. They don't commit murder. Poirot regarded him mildly. True, but disappointment combined with fear is more persuasive. Fear of what? Clara asked quietly. Poirot answered at once. Fear of time. He stood and walked slowly toward the window, where the snow pressed against the glass like a held breath. Samuel Wright was a man who used delay as a weapon, Poirot said. He postponed, he threatened, he promised latter, and later never arrived. Dr. Ames frowned. You're suggesting someone believed later would never come. Yes, Poirot replied, or that when it did, it would be too late. He turned back to them. Yesterday morning, Samuel Wright made it clear the future would be controlled by him. The present would be endured, and the end, whenever it came, would be managed. Eleanor's voice dropped. He said something else. Poirot looked at her. Yes. He said the clock was running out, she said. For all of us. The words settled heavily in the room. Poirot closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. A man who speaks like that, he said, invites response. Marcus Hill stopped pacing. You think this was about money? No, Poirot said gently. It was about power. He looked at each of them in turn. Money can wait. Pride cannot. Fear cannot. Clara Finch spoke suddenly, her voice strained. He said, I would always belong to this house. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Belong. Yes, she said. That I was useful, that was his word. Poirot nodded slowly. And usefulness, when extended indefinitely, becomes a prison. Nathan Cole shifted uneasily near the door. Sir, everyone here depended on him. Exactly, Poirot replied. Dependence breeds patience, until patience is exhausted. He returned to his chair. The will was to be revised. Control was to be extended. And the new year was to begin with everyone reminded of their place. He paused. But one person, Poirot continued, could not endure another hour. Marcus Hill's face darkened. You're accusing someone without proof. Poirot smiled faintly. No, monsieur, I am measuring time. He gestured toward the unseen clock. The poison required minutes, the clock required precision, the night required witnesses, and the motive required urgency. He looked at them steadily. Summer needed the night to end exactly when it did, not sooner, not later. Outside, the wind rose, sharp and insistent. Inside, fear settled where denial had once lived. Because when time runs out, Poirot knew, people do not wait. They act. Chapter 8. The adjusted schedule Hercule Poirot requested the household gather once again in the drawing room, though by now the room had taken on a peculiar weight. It was not just the grief of Samuel Wright's death. It was a heavy sense of awareness, the feeling that something carefully hidden had been exposed. Even the grandfather clock, frozen in its silent vigil at midnight, seemed to dominate the space more than ever. Eleanor Wright sat stiffly on the sofa, her hands pressed tightly together. Marcus Hill paced, restless, as though the act of movement could stave off the realization of what had occurred. Clara Finch hovered near the fireplace, nervously twisting a corner of her notebook. Nathan Cole stood by the doorway, alert and uneasy, the household staff having been dismissed under polite pretense. Dr. Ames remained in his usual posture, composed but clearly unsettled. Poirot, standing near the clock, adjusted his jacket and folded his hands behind his back. His gaze swept over the group with meticulous attention. Let us consider, Poirot began, the sequence of events as they truly occurred. You have given me accounts of your movements, all seemingly consistent, but memory, like time, can be deceived. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. I have studied the clock. The mechanism shows a small adjustment screw was tightened, purposefully. With knowledge, this action alone does not kill a man. It serves another function. Manipulation. The clock is a stage, not the executioner. Dr. Ames frowned. Manipulation? You mean someone wanted to make us focus on the clock? Precisely, Doctor, Poirot replied. The clock was fixed earlier in the evening, minutes or hours before midnight. The murderer created a condition where the hands would stop, commanding the attention of every observer at the appointed moment. Midnight became an event, a distraction. Marcus Hill spoke quickly. So the poison was added after the clock was adjusted. Poirot inclined his head, acknowledging the deduction. Yes, the timing required two separate actions. First, the mechanism was prepared. Second, the slow-acting poison was introduced into the brandy. The poison, dormant while the liquid was cool, would only awaken when warmth and time conspired. That is why the victim could handle the glass, could sip and hold it, and yet collapse only at the precise instant. Clara Finch's hands trembled. And the rest of us? We only remember the striking of midnight, the shock, not the act itself. Exactly, Poirot said softly, pacing slowly along the length of the room. Memory can be guided. Attention can be directed. Midnight. The hands stopped, a glass held, a heart fails. But the witnesses, the family remember only the clock, not the method, not the exact moment of the poison's effect. Eleanor Wright, her voice strained, asked, You mean everything was staged? Poirot stopped and turned toward her, his gaze calm, almost gentle. Not staged for you, madame, staged for the perception of reality. The murderer relied upon the natural tendency to trust time. They understood how people are trained to notice the hour, not the subtleties of circumstance. The hour was their ally. Dr. Ames interjected cautiously. So the sequence was, first the clock, then the poison, Then the collapse. Yes, Poirot said, but there is more. Consider the risk involved. The poison had to be administered at a time when Samuel Wright would drink in the expected fashion. The clock had to stop at the exact moment. The witnesses had to be in place, looking, observing, calculating nothing. Marcus Hill shook his head. It seems impossibly precise. Poirot's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement. It is precise, Monsieur Hill, because the perpetrator had control, patience, knowledge, intimate familiarity with the house, the habits of its occupants, and the instruments within it. Precision is rarely a matter of chance. Clara Finch whispered. Memory can be manipulated. Indeed, Poirot said. Humans are excellent at recalling the extraordinary, the dramatic, the alarming. They forget the small, the subtle, the orchestrated. The striking of midnight, the sudden collapse, the sound of a clock stopping, these remain in our minds. The administration of poison, invisible, unnoticed, and yet entirely effective. He moved closer to the table where Samuel Wright's glass had stood. The victim's hand, the liquid, the warmth, the precise moment, all were instruments. The clock was merely a signal, a herald, not the cause. Death is seldom obvious. It prefers subtlety, method, perfection. Eleanor Wright's expression had grown pale, and yet we all believed it was sudden heart failure, natural, unavoidable. Poirot inclined his head. Because that is what the murderer intended. They relied on the illusion of chance, on your acceptance of natural order. They trusted that you would not question the clock, the hour, or the glass. They trusted that order and the predictability of human behavior would conceal the deliberate. Dr. Ames finally spoke, his voice subdued, acknowledging the subtle brilliance of the act. It is elegant, horrible, but elegant. Poirot smiled. Faintly, not with pleasure, but with quiet admiration for methodical intelligence. Yes, elegance in crime is not measured by beauty, but by the exactitude of design, the orchestration of moments, the manipulation of perception. The murderer has used the night, the clock, the warmth, the glass, and the expectation of routine to execute an act that appears as fate. That is why I say memory, like clocks, can be manipulated. Nathan Cole shifted, uneasy, and the timing, why midnight? Poirot's eyes rested on the frozen hands of the grandfather clock. Because midnight is dramatic, predictable, commanding. Everyone watches the clock. No one questions the act occurring behind that precise attention. Midnight ensured the witnesses would see a moment, not a method. Midnight guaranteed that perception would be misdirected. He paused, letting the silence deepen. Then, softly, the night, the poison, the clock, the witnesses, all elements arranged with care. The hour was a signal, the act was hidden. The memory of the event became the murderer's shield. Marcus Hill's voice trembled slightly. So everything we trusted, time, routine, Samuel's habits, it was used against us. Poirot inclined his head. Yes, Monsieur Hill, and that is the cleverness of crime. The more predictable the environment, the easier it is to manipulate the outcome. Precision, observation, knowledge, patience. These are the tools of a killer who understands that clocks can lie as effectively as people can. The room fell silent, the snow outside pressing against the windows like a frozen witness. Poirot's eyes, dark and observant, remained on the clock. The hands had not moved, yet he seemed to see the subtle passage of minutes, each tick orchestrated in his mind's eye, revealing the meticulous choreography of murder. Remember, Poirot said quietly, the method is always revealed through sequence. The clock was fixed first, the poison administered second, and the collapse. Well, timed the night, the hour, the witnesses, they all serve the memory, and the memory serves the murderer. Eleanor Wright shivered. And yet, who could have known everything? Poirot's gaze swept the assembled household, calculating, discerning, precise. That, madame, we shall soon discover, for only someone familiar with this house, its habits and its secrets, could have adjusted the schedule with such cunning. The frozen hands of the grandfather clock loomed behind him. Time itself had been instructed, and yet, for Poirot, the truth was already in motion. Chapter 9. When the clock spoke, the drawing room was heavy with tension. Snow pressed against the tall windows, muffling the world beyond charcoal point. Yet inside, the air seemed charged with accusation. Hercule Poirot stood near the frozen grandfather clock, his posture impeccably straight, hands clasped behind him, eyes sharp and calculating. The assembled household, the Wrights, Marcus Hill, Clara Finch, Nathan Cole, and Dr. Ames, stood scattered about the room, silent, uneasy, as though waiting for some inevitable reckoning. Poirot's gaze swept the group with meticulous care, noting the slightest tremble in a hand, the subtle flush on a cheek, the tension in a shoulder. Every micro-expression was a thread in the fabric of truth, and he was ready to unravel it. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice calm, deliberate, and unmistakably authoritative. "We have reached a moment where the facts must be aligned with conscience. The night, the clock, the final drink, all of these are not mere accidents. They were orchestrated." Eleanor Wright shifted in her seat. "Orchestrated, Monsieur Poirot. Enough. We've been through this. There is no crime here beyond poor health." Poirot's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, met hers. "Madame Poor Health cannot explain precision. Sudden death does not align exactly with the halting of a clock, unless someone guides both events." Marcus Hill's jaw tightened. "You are accusing us all, sir." "What nonsense." Poirot's lips curved slightly. "I accuse no one without evidence. But I will speak of inevitability. Consider carefully." He gestured toward the side table where Samuel Wright's glass had stood. The final drink was prepared to appear harmless, a gentleman's indulgence, ordinary brandy, yet it contained a subtle agent, activated only by warmth, delayed by design, timed to coincide with the arrival of midnight. The moment was orchestrated. The shock was precise. The observers, each of you, believed in nature, in fate. The clock was your authority, and the frozen hands were its proof. But the clock, my friends, is not alive. The glass, the liquid, and the poison are tools in the hands of a human mind. The room fell silent. Clara Finch's fingers trembled against the edge of her notebook. Nathan Cole shifted uneasily, as though poised to speak, yet wary of the consequences. Marcus Hill's fists clenched at his sides. Eleanor Wright's breathing was shallow, yet she maintained her rigid composure. Poirot's gaze fixed on a single figure, Nathan Cole. The household manager had been present at every critical moment, intimate with the routines of the house, knowledgeable of the clock's mechanism, trusted implicitly by Samuel Wright. A careful observer would note the subtle way Cole's eyes flicked to the frozen hands at midnight each time Poirot mentioned the sequence. "Consider, Monsieur Cole," Poirot said quietly, yet with a sharp edge that cut through the tension, "who had knowledge of the clock's inner workings, who understood exactly how to make it stop, commanding attention without suspicion, who had access to the brandy and could ensure that the poison would act precisely." Cole's hands clenched involuntarily. He opened his mouth, closed it again. I don't..." Poirot's voice remained calm, almost indulgent. "Monsieur, do not falter. I am not here to pass judgment. I am here to reconstruct truth. The poison was not intended to harm violently or dramatically. It was meant to appear as if nature had taken its course. The heart failed suddenly. Everyone believed it. Even Samuel Wright himself, the master of timing and control, would have been unaware of its subtle arrival." Marcus Hill's face paled. "So it was. Planned." "Yes," Poirot said. "Every detail. The final drink, the adjustment of the clock, the positioning of the witnesses. Each element contributed to the illusion of inevitability. The frozen hands ensured belief, just as a stage prop ensures suspension of disbelief. But here is the truth, my friends. Time, while it can be manipulated, always resumes." Poirot's voice deepened slightly, compelling attention. "Monsieur Cole, You intended that this night appear as accident. You counted upon the precision of the mechanism, the subtlety of the poison, the obedience of memory itself. But you did not account for observation, nor for deduction, nor for the way truth returns to its rightful place. Cole faltered, his composure cracking. His eyes darted around the room, desperately seeking escape, yet finding none. The household stared, the weight of expectation pressing down. I did not mean for... Cole began, his voice breaking. Poirot's hand raised gently, still commanding yet non-threatening. Silence. Sylvain Plaffitti. It is better that the confession be orderly. Let us not rush the unraveling of events. But you see, monsieur, a murder constructed with such precision carries within it the seeds of revelation. Your careful schedule, your reliance upon fear and distraction, the frozen clock, and the manipulated brandy, they were all meant to mislead. But they also spoke. The night itself bore witness, and I have listened. Cole sank slowly into a chair, his face pale, lines of guilt etched deeply. Yes, I did it. I knew Samuel Wright's habits. I knew the clock. I thought no one would suspect. I thought the night, the hour, would cover everything. Poirot nodded. You acted with understanding, patience, and knowledge. Yet you underestimated one principle: time, like truth, always resumes. The clock may stop, the hands may freeze, but the facts, the sequence, the method, the motive, cannot be hidden forever. The very precision you relied upon has revealed you. Clara Finch whispered, barely audible, all this, just for control. Control, Poirot said gently, is a powerful motivator. Fear of loss, impatience with delay, resentment at perceived injustice. These transform knowledge into action. Monsieur Cole's fear of exposure, of losing influence and privilege, overcame prudence. Yet the crime, elegant as it was, could not remain concealed from reason. Eleanor Wright spoke finally, her voice trembling. And the clock. Poirot gestured toward it. The clock, madame, was a cover. It held attention, misdirected thought, commanded belief. The frozen hands created the illusion of inevitability, but the clock did not kill. The poison, carefully timed, did. The mind that devised both relied upon perception, just as a magician relies upon misdirection. And yet perception, when observed with method and patience, cannot deceive the trained eye. Dr. Ames, still standing slightly apart, admitted quietly, I see it now. The collapse, the timing, it was all orchestrated. Poirot's eyes softened, yet remained piercing. Yes, Dr. Nature was deceived. Memory was guided, routine was exploited, and the frozen clock attempted to seal belief. But as I have said, time and truth always resumes. The hands of justice, unlike the hands of a clock, move steadily. They catch up, inevitably. Nathan Cole, now fully aware that concealment had failed, lowered his head. The tension broke slightly, replaced with a profound, shameful resignation. Poirot, standing calmly, concluded, every detail has been observed, every pattern understood. The clock spoke, indeed, but not as intended. It spoke truth to me, revealing the method behind the seeming accident. And now, justice, guided by reason and evidence, must follow. The frozen hands loomed silently behind him, still fixed at midnight. Yet the night had spoken, the truth had emerged, time had resumed. Chapter 10. Time moves on. Charcoal Point had settled into a fragile stillness. The snow, pale and unbroken, carpeted the grounds in silence, muting even the distant echoes of the village beyond the estate gates. Inside, the house seemed larger, emptier, as though the walls themselves had exhaled the tension of the past days. The absence of Samuel Wright, once the heart of its routines and its strict discipline, was tangible, almost oppressive. Hercule Poirot moved deliberately through the drawing room, his small, precise steps echoing faintly against the polished floors. The grandfather clock, now repaired, ticked once more, its hands sweeping past midnight as though nothing had ever halted their progress. The sound, subtle yet constant, seemed to mark a return to order, yet carried with it the weight of memory, a reminder that while time may pause, it never forgets. Poirot's eyes lingered on the glass table where Samuel Wright's brandy had once stood. The amber liquid had long been removed, the glass polished until it reflected the light of the tall windows. It was a simple object, yet it had been the instrument of murder, the conduit of both subtlety and precision. Poirot's mind revisited the events of that night. The careful adjustment of the clock, the slow, acting poison, the placement of each observer, and the seemingly natural collapse of Samuel Wright himself. Everything had been planned, every detail orchestrated, yet no force of human design could ultimately conceal truth from a methodical mind. Eleanor Wright entered quietly, her posture slightly straighter than before, though shadows of grief lingered in her expression. Marcus Hill followed, subdued and contemplative, while Clara Finch lingered near the fire, still processing the implications of what had transpired. Nathan Cole, who had confessed under Poirot's gentle, yet unyielding scrutiny, remained silent, his hands clasped nervously, an air of resignation about him. Even Dr. Ames, accustomed to certainty in the natural order of life and death, seemed reflective, humbled by the intricacies of human calculation and misdirection. Poirot gestured for the group to gather around the repaired clock. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice calm but carrying an unassailable authority, "the passage of time is the truest witness. It observes without prejudice, it measures without emotion, it notes all, though it may pause. And tonight, we have observed that time, when respected and studied, can reveal truths hidden even from the cleverest of humans." Eleanor Wright spoke softly. "Monsieur Poirot, the house feels different now, lighter yet emptier." "Yes, madame," Poirot replied. "The illusion has been stripped away. Where once was tension, control, and fear, now remains clarity. The house no longer shields misdeeds, its routines no longer hide intent. Samuel Wright's presence, though absent, lingers in memory, but the methods of deception that accompanied him have been unveiled." Marcus Hill, speaking for the first time in several hours, asked, "Do you believe justice is complete, the culprit punished?" Poirot's gaze settled on Nathan Cole, who now stood quietly at the edge of the room. "Justice," Poirot said, "is not merely a question of punishment. It is the restoration of order, the revelation of truth, the acknowledgement that every act, no matter how carefully concealed, leaves traces. Time is the arbiter of consequence, and in this case, it has ensured that reason has prevailed. The culprit has been identified, confession obtained, and the sequence of events made known. That is justice, of a sort." Clara Finch looked at him, her expression still tinged with fear and curiosity. "And the clock? It will continue to tick, even after all of this?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, mademoiselle, the clock resumes its work, but it also remembers. Each tick marks not only the present moment, but the past, the choices made, the truths uncovered. Time does not forgive, nor does it forget. It moves inexorably onward, carrying with it both the memory of what has been and the lessons for those who remain." Outside, the sky was pale with January light, clouds drifting slowly across the frozen landscape. The house seemed to breathe, quieter now, stripped of illusions, its secrets laid bare. Poirot stepped to the window, looking out at the still grounds where Samuel Wright's coffin had been carried to its final resting place. The earth was cold, the snow untouched save for the impressions of those who had gathered to mourn. "In our lives," Poirot reflected aloud, "we often wish for time to pause, to grant us reprieve, to delay the consequences of our actions. Yet pause is but a fleeting illusion. Time always resumes, and with it comes reckoning. We may manipulate hours, deceive the senses, and conceal intent. But in the end, time's judgment is patient, relentless, and impartial." Eleanor Wright, now standing beside him, whispered, "And yet, life must continue." "Oui, madame," Poirot agreed, with a small, gentle smile. "Life continues. We honor the memory of those lost. We learn from the machinations revealed, and we step forward with knowledge. Time, in its quiet power, reminds us that order returns, that truth endures, and that even when the hands of a clock have been frozen, the rhythm of life cannot be stopped indefinitely. Marcus Hill let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. So the house, the clock, the night, it's all over. Poirot's gaze softened, but remained unwavering. The night, Monsieur Hill, is over. The clock ticks again, but the lessons of its silence remain. Samuel Wright's control has ended. The house has been cleansed of deception, and we, who remain, carry forward the knowledge that time observes all, and in the end, balances all things. A faint chime echoed from the repaired clock, marking the top of the hour. Poirot's eyes lingered on the hands as they moved with steady certainty. A simple reminder that life continues in spite of tragedy, in spite of calculation, in spite of human error. "Let us leave the past where it belongs," he said softly, "and step forward, for though time may pause, it never forgets, and we must honor both its constancy and its lessons." The household departed quietly, the house still and reflective, yet gradually accepting a restored order. Poirot lingered a moment longer, absorbing the serenity, the certainty, and the subtle triumph of reason over artifice. Finally, he turned and walked from the drawing-room, the sound of the grandfather clock ticking steadily behind him, a rhythmic affirmation that, at last, time moves on.